Storm's unmistakable tears splashed onto Emma's fresh grave, a display of grief so raw and human that the gathered mourners froze in stunned disbelief. The next morning, when the mare broke free from her locked paddock and led Emma's parents to a hidden treasure no one knew existed, their understanding of death itself began to crumble. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The small town of Willowbrook was never a place where extraordinary things happened. It was a quiet community nestled between rolling hills and expansive meadows, where life moved at its own unhurried pace. The residents knew each other by name, shared Sunday dinners, and gathered for local events with the comfortable familiarity of people who had spent generations living side by side. In this unassuming place, 13-year-old Emma Carter had lived her entire life, growing up in a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of town with her parents, James and Margaret. Emma was different from other children her age. While most teenagers were drawn to technology and social gatherings, Emma found her joy in the open fields and the company of animals. She had a gift, people said, a way with creatures that seemed almost magical. Birds would land on her outstretched hands, shy deer would approach her in the forest, and even the most temperamental farm animals would grow calm under her touch. But of all the connections Emma formed with the animal world, none was as profound as the bond she shared with a horse named Storm. Storm had come into Emma's life on her 10th birthday, a gift from her grandfather before he passed away. The young chestnut mare with a white star on her forehead was beautiful, but wild, untrusting of humans after suffering abuse from a previous owner. Experts said Storm was too damaged, too unpredictable to be around a child. They recommended selling her to someone who could handle her volatile nature, but Emma refused to give up on the frightened animal. "She's not bad," Emma had insisted to her worried parents. "She's just scared and hurt. She needs someone to show her that not all humans are cruel." Day after day, Emma would sit by the fence of the paddock, reading books aloud, singing songs, or simply talking to Storm as if the horse could understand every word. For weeks, the mare kept her distance, watching the girl with wary eyes. But Emma was patient. She never pushed, never demanded anything from Storm. She simply offered her presence, a gentle constancy that slowly began to erode the walls the horse had built around herself. The first breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon in April. Emma was sitting under an old oak tree at the edge of the paddock, sheltered from the drizzle, reading her favorite book. Without warning, Storm approached, her hooves making soft sounds in the damp earth. The mare stopped a few feet away, her ears forward, her eyes fixed on Emma. The girl continued reading, her voice never faltering, though her heart raced with excitement. After a few minutes, Storm took another step forward and then another, until she was close enough that Emma could feel her warm breath. Slowly, moving with deliberate care, Emma raised her hand. Storm hesitated, then pressed her muzzle against the girl's palm. From that moment, a bond began to form between them that transcended the ordinary relationship between a girl and her pet. They developed a language of their own, a communication that needed no words. Emma seemed to anticipate Storm's needs before the mare even expressed them, and Storm responded to the subtlest cues from the girl. They became inseparable companions, spending hours exploring the countryside together, Emma perched on Storm's back, the two of them moving as one. The townsfolk marveled at the transformation of the once wild horse. "It's like they share the same soul," Margaret once remarked to a neighbor watching her daughter and Storm galloping across an open field. Emma's laughter carried back to them on the wind. Life continued this way for 3 years, a beautiful friendship blooming between the girl and the horse. Emma grew taller, her childhood freckles fading as she approached her teenage years, while Storm matured into a magnificent mare, her coat gleaming with health and her eyes bright with intelligence. They competed in local riding competitions, not always winning, but always demonstrating a harmony that left spectators in awe. They volunteered at therapeutic riding centers, where Storm's gentleness with disabled children revealed the depth of her transformation. They were a familiar sight in Willowbrook, the slender girl and her chestnut mare, inseparable and devoted to each other. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The change came subtly at first. Emma began to tire more easily during their rides. Her usual boundless energy gave way to unexpected fatigue. She developed headaches that would leave her confined to a darkened room for hours. Margaret and James noticed the pallor in their daughter's usually rosy cheeks, the shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. "It's probably just growing pains," the family doctor initially suggested, "or perhaps a virus that needs to run its course." But as weeks passed and Emma's condition deteriorated, more tests were ordered. The diagnosis, when it finally came, fell like a hammer blow. Leukemia, aggressive and already advanced. The doctor spoke of treatments, of chemotherapy and radiation, of fighting and hope, but their eyes betrayed the gravity of Emma's situation. Through the grueling treatments that followed, Storm became Emma's anchor. On days when the girl was strong enough to leave her bed, her parents would help her to the paddock where Storm waited, as if sensing the exact moment Emma would appear. The horse would stand perfectly still as James lifted his weakened daughter onto her back, then walk with exquisite care around the enclosure, carrying her precious burden with a gentleness that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Even when Emma became too weak for riding, Storm remained a constant presence. The mare would stand for hours at the bedroom window where Emma's bed had been moved, her head extending into the room through the open sash. Emma would reach out to stroke Storm's muzzle, drawing comfort from the warm breath on her increasingly frail hand. "Don't worry, girl," Emma would whisper during these quiet moments. "No matter what happens, we'll always be together. I promise." As autumn gave way to winter, Emma's strength ebbed like the daylight. The treatments that ravaged her body failed to stem the tide of her illness. In the quiet hours of a December night, with her parents holding her hands and Storm keeping vigil at the window, Emma Carter slipped away from the world, just 2 months shy of her 14th birthday. The grief that descended upon the Carter household was all-consuming. James and Margaret moved through the days following their daughter's death like sleepwalkers, making arrangements in a fog of disbelief and sorrow. The entire town of Willowbrook mourned with them. Emma had touched many lives in her brief time, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had known her. But no one's grief was more profound or more visible than Storm's. From the moment Emma died, the mare refused to eat or drink. She stood at the bedroom window where she had watched over her young friend, nickering softly as if calling for Emma to return. When the window was finally closed, Storm moved to the fence line, facing the house, standing sentinel through rain and cold, her head lowered in what could only be described as despair. The day of Emma's funeral dawned gray and somber, as if the sky itself was mourning. A light snow had fallen overnight, covering Willowbrook in a silent blanket of white that muffled sounds and softened edges. James and Margaret Carter moved through the mourning rituals with mechanical precision, their grief too vast to be contained in tears. The community had rallied around them, bringing food that remained untouched, offering words of comfort that fell on deaf ears. Nothing could penetrate the bubble of sorrow that surrounded them as they prepared to say a final goodbye to their only child. At the Carter farm, Mike Henderson, a longtime family friend who had helped care for the animals since Emma's diagnosis, approached the paddock where Storm stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The mare had barely moved in 3 days, refusing food and water, her once gleaming coat now dull with dust and neglect. "Hey, girl," Mike said softly, holding out an apple. "You need to eat something. Emma wouldn't want you to waste away like this." At the mention of Emma's name, Storm's ears flickered, but she made no move toward the offered treat. Mike sighed, placing the apple on the fence post before turning to leave. As he walked away, he heard a soft, mournful whicker that raised the hair on the back of his neck. It sounded almost human in its anguish. Back at the house, Margaret stood in Emma's room, clutching a small silver horse pendant that had been her daughter's favorite piece of jewelry. She had planned to place it in Emma's casket, a final gift to accompany her child on her journey. But now, staring out the window at Storm's solitary vigil, she reconsidered. "James," she called to her husband, I think I need to do something before we leave." James appeared in the doorway, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief. "What is it?" Margaret held up the pendant, its surface catching the pale winter light. "This was meant for Emma, but I think Storm needs it more now. She's suffering just as much as we are." James nodded, understanding. In the midst of their own devastating loss, they couldn't ignore the pain of the animal their daughter had loved so deeply. Together, they walked out to the paddock, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. Storm watched their approach with dull eyes, but when Margaret held out her hand with the silver pendant resting on her palm, the horse took a hesitant step forward. For the first time since Emma's death, Storm seemed to focus on something beyond her grief. "This was hers," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "She'd want you to have it now." With gentle movements, James helped fasten the pendant to Storm's halter, where it gleamed against the dark leather. The mare stood perfectly still during this process, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. When they finished, Storm lowered her head to nudge Margaret's shoulder, a gesture so reminiscent of the way she used to greet Emma that fresh tears sprang to the woman's eyes. "I know, girl," she whispered. "We miss her too." As they turned to leave, James hesitated. "Should we bring Storm to the cemetery?" The words caught in his throat. Emma would have wanted her there. Margaret considered this, remembering how inseparable the two had been in life. "Yes," she finally agreed. "Emma would have wanted that." Mike helped them lead Storm to the trailer, the mare following with uncharacteristic docility, as if she understood the significance of the journey. The small procession made its way to Willowbrook Cemetery, where a crowd had already gathered despite the cold. The sight of Storm being led behind the family car caused whispers among the mourners, but no one questioned the presence of the horse. Everyone in town knew what Emma and Storm had meant to each other. The service was brief, but heartfelt, with Emma's favorite teacher reading a poem and a childhood friend sharing memories that brought sad smiles to the faces of those gathered around the small grave. Throughout it all, Storm stood at the edge of the gathering, flanked by Mike and James, her head low and her eyes fixed on the small white casket adorned with winter roses. When it came time to lower the casket into the ground, a sound escaped from Storm that silenced the murmured prayers and quiet weeping of the mourners. It was a noise unlike any the horse had made before, part whicker, part moan, a sound of such raw pain that several people later admitted to feeling chills run down their spines. As the first handfuls of earth fell onto the casket, Storm pulled against Mike's hold, trying to move closer to the grave. Rather than restrain her, he gently guided her forward, allowing her to approach the edge. There, Storm stretched her neck out and down, her nostrils flaring as she took in the scent of the disturbed earth and the flowers. A single tear, something many would later debate whether horses were even capable of, seemed to roll from her eye, leaving a dark track on her face. The funeral concluded, and gradually the mourners dispersed, offering final condolences to the Carters before returning to the warmth of their cars. But when Mike attempted to lead Storm back to the trailer, the horse planted her feet firmly in the snow and refused to move. "Come on, girl," he urged. "It's time to go home." Storm remained immovable, her eyes never leaving the mound of fresh earth that now covered Emma's resting place. After several failed attempts to budge her, Mike approached James and Margaret, who were receiving the last of the condolences from the minister. "She won't leave," he explained. "I've never seen her like this. It's like she's rooted to the spot." James looked over at Storm, then at the darkening sky which threatened more snow. "What should we do? We can't leave her here in this weather." "I'll stay with her a while longer," Mike offered. "Maybe she just needs more time to say goodbye." Margaret nodded, her face etched with the exhaustion of grief. "We'll wait in the car. Take as long as she needs." As the cemetery emptied and dusk began to fall, Storm remained in her vigil by Emma's grave, occasionally pawing at the ground or making soft nickering sounds. Mike stayed beside her, his hand resting on her neck, offering what comfort he could to the grieving animal. Finally, as the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall, Storm allowed herself to be led away, though she turned her head repeatedly to look back at the small mound with its covering of flowers now dusted with fresh snow. That night, Storm returned to her paddock but refused to enter her stable, despite the increasing snowfall. Instead, she stood facing the direction of the cemetery, miles away but apparently fixed in her awareness. James brought her blankets and Mike ensured she had fresh water and hay, though she showed no interest in either. "Will she be okay?" Margaret asked as they watched from the kitchen window, the horse's dark silhouette barely visible in the gathering darkness. "I don't know," James admitted. "Emma was her whole world. I'm not sure Storm knows how to exist without her." Neither of them voiced the fear that was growing in their hearts, that they might lose Storm too, not to illness, but to a broken heart. In the quiet house, with Emma's absence like a physical pain between them, the thought of also losing this last living connection to their daughter was almost unbearable. Outside, as the snow continued to fall and the world grew quieter, Storm remained at her post, the silver pendant catching occasional glints of moonlight as clouds parted momentarily overhead. She stood as a sentinel, guarding the memory of a bond that even death could not sever, her breath forming ghost-like clouds in the frigid night air. The night passed slowly for the Carter household. James and Margaret drifted in and out of restless sleep, each awakening with the momentary cruel hope that the previous day had been nothing but a nightmare, only to have reality crash down upon them anew. In the spare bedroom that had become his temporary quarters, Mike tossed and turned, his mind replaying the image of Storm standing immobile by Emma's grave, refusing to leave until the darkness and cold had become too much to bear. Just before dawn, James gave up on sleep entirely. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, stepping out into the bitter cold of the winter morning. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, transforming the farm into a landscape of pristine white. His breath formed clouds in the air as he made his way toward Storm's paddock, expecting to find the horse huddled in the corner where she had last been seen. The paddock was empty. A surge of panic shot through James as he quickly scanned the enclosure. The gate stood open, swinging slightly in the gentle morning breeze. Impossibly, there were no tracks in the fresh snow inside the paddock, as if Storm had vanished into thin air rather than walked away. "Margaret," James called as he ran back toward the house. "Mike." Minutes later, the three of them stood at the open gate, bewildered and concerned. "I checked it twice before turning in," Mike insisted, his face pale with worry. "It was definitely latched." "Could someone have taken her?" Margaret asked, her voice thin with fear. The thought of losing this last connection to Emma was almost too much to bear. James shook his head. "In this weather? And without leaving any tire tracks on the drive?" He gestured to the unmarked expanse of snow that covered the long driveway leading to the main road. "Besides, who would take Storm? Everyone in town knows what she means to us." "Then where is she?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears of frustration and grief. She couldn't just disappear. Mike was examining the ground just outside the gate. "There are tracks here," he announced. "They're partially filled with snow, but they're definitely storms." He pointed to hoof prints leading away from the paddock, not toward the house or barn, but in the direction of the road that led to town. "She broke out," James said, disbelief coloring his voice. Storm had never before attempted to escape, even when she had first arrived and was still wild with fear. But why? And how did she manage to open the gate? "Emma," Margaret whispered, her face suddenly drained of color. "She's going to Emma." The men stared at her, understanding dawning on their faces. Without another word, they rushed to James's truck. The cemetery was 5 miles away, a long journey through snow-covered roads, especially for a horse traveling alone in the bitter cold of a winter morning. As they drove slowly along the route between the farm and Willowbrook Cemetery, they scanned the roadside for any sign of storm. The fresh snow made visibility difficult, and the hoofprints they had found at the paddock gate were soon lost among the drifts and the tire tracks of early morning commuters. "There!" Mike suddenly shouted, pointing ahead. A dark shape moved against the whiteness, plodding steadily along the side of the road. James slowed the truck, pulling alongside the horse. Storm didn't acknowledge their presence, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her gait unwavering despite the obvious exhaustion that showed in her heaving flanks and the steam rising from her sweat-dampened coat. "Storm," Margaret called softly from the passenger window. "Storm, girl, stop." The horse continued as if she hadn't heard, her determination evident in every step. James looked at the speedometer, 3 miles per hour. At that pace, Storm had been walking for hours, having left the farm long before dawn. "What do we do?" Mike asked from the back seat. "We can't just let her keep going. She'll collapse from exhaustion." James considered their options. They could try to block her path with the truck, but if Storm was determined enough, she might injure herself trying to get around them. They could attempt to lasso her, but without proper restraints, they risked hurting her or themselves. "Let's follow her," he decided finally. "See where she's really going. If it's the cemetery." He didn't finish the sentence. None of them wanted to confront what it might mean if Storm was indeed making a deliberate journey to Emma's grave. They trailed behind Storm at a crawl, watching as she navigated the road with single-minded focus. Other cars passed them, drivers slowing to stare at the unusual procession, a horse plodding through the snow, followed by a pickup truck inching along at walking pace. As they approached the outskirts of town, there was no doubt about Storm's destination. She turned unerringly onto the narrow lane that led to Willowbrook Cemetery, her pace quickening slightly despite her obvious fatigue. The cemetery gates stood open, as they always did during daylight hours. Storm passed through them without hesitation, her hoofbeats muffled by the snow as she made her way between the rows of headstones. James parked the truck outside the gates, and the three of them followed on foot, maintaining a respectful distance as the horse navigated the path with eerie precision. Emma's grave, still a mound of fresh earth partially covered with snow and wilting flowers, lay in the newer section of the cemetery, under the spreading branches of an old oak tree. Storm approached it directly, as if drawn by an invisible cord, finally stopping at the exact spot where she had stood during the funeral the day before. James, Margaret, and Mike watched in stunned silence as Storm lowered her head to the grave, her nostrils flaring as she took in the scent of the disturbed earth. Then, with a gentleness that seemed almost reverential, she sank to her knees in the snow beside the mound. Is she lying down?" Mike whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. Indeed, Storm was carefully lowering her body to the ground, folding her legs beneath her until she lay fully recumbent beside Emma's grave. Once settled, she stretched her neck out until her head rested on the mound itself, her muzzle gently touching the frozen earth. Margaret let out a sob, her hand flying to her mouth. "I've never seen her do that before. Not even with Emma." Horses don't usually lie down in the open like that, Mike agreed, his voice hushed. They're too vulnerable. They only do it when they feel completely safe. Or completely broken, James thought, but didn't say. The three of them stood watching, uncertain what to do. The morning light strengthened around them, casting long shadows across the snow-covered graves. Other visitors began to arrive at the cemetery, some coming to pay respects to lost loved ones, others drawn by the unusual sight of a horse lying beside a fresh grave. They kept a respectful distance, but their presence added to the surreal quality of the scene. "Should we try to get her up?" James finally asked. "Take her home?" Before anyone could answer, a sound emerged from Storm that stopped every conversation, freezing onlookers in place. It started as a low rumble, building into a keening whinny that echoed across the cemetery, a sound of such profound sorrow that several bystanders later described it as more human than animal. It rose and fell, wavering in the cold air like a lament, before fading into a series of softer, hiccuping whickers that sounded unnervingly like sobs. "She's crying," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her own face. "James, our horse is crying for our daughter." No one corrected her, though conventional wisdom held that horses couldn't cry from emotion. In that moment, watching Storm's body shudder with grief beside Emma's grave, no other explanation seemed possible. Word of Storm's vigil spread quickly through Willowbrook. By midday, a small crowd had gathered at the cemetery, keeping a respectful distance but unable to tear themselves away from the extraordinary scene of the grieving horse. Among them was Dr. Rachel Wilson, the local veterinarian who had cared for Storm since Emma had first brought the traumatized mare home 3 years ago. Rachel approached James and Margaret, who hadn't left the cemetery since discovering Storm that morning. They stood huddled together against the cold, their faces etched with exhaustion and a bewildering mix of grief and wonder. "How long has she been like this?" Rachel asked quietly, her professional demeanor softened by the emotion of the moment. "Since about 7 this morning," James replied, checking his watch. "Going on 5 hours now. She broke out of the paddock sometime during the night." Rachel nodded, her eyes never leaving the horse. "Has she had any water? Food?" "Mike brought some from the truck," Margaret said. "She wouldn't touch it." The veterinarian's face showed her concern. "She can't stay out here indefinitely. The temperature is dropping, and she's already weakened from not eating since Emma." She trailed off, not wanting to cause more pain by stating the obvious. "We know," James said, his voice hollow. "But how do we move her? I won't force her away from Emma. I can't do that to her." Rachel considered this, understanding the impossible position the Carters found themselves in. Storm's behavior defied conventional understanding of equine psychology. Horses grieved, yes. They could become depressed, withdrawn, even ill after losing a companion. But this deliberate pilgrimage to Emma's grave, this human-like display of mourning, went beyond anything in Rachel's experience or training. "Let me examine her first," she decided. "Make sure she's not in immediate danger. Then we can figure out next steps." Slowly, telegraphing her movements as she would with any distressed animal, Rachel approached Storm. The mare's eyes tracked her, but she made no move to rise from her position beside Emma's grave. As Rachel knelt in the snow to check Storm's vital signs, she was struck by the intelligence and awareness in the horse's gaze, and by something else, something she couldn't quite name, that sent a shiver up her spine despite her scientific training. After a thorough examination, Rachel returned to the Carters. Physically, she's stable but exhausted. Her heart rate is elevated, and she's showing signs of dehydration. She needs proper shelter, food, and water within the next few hours. She hesitated before adding, "But I don't think we should sedate her to move her. In her weakened state with the cold, it could be dangerous." "Then what do we do?" Margaret asked, desperation edging her voice. Rachel looked back at Storm, then at the darkening sky that threatened more snow before nightfall. I have an idea, but it's unconventional. By late afternoon, with the help of Mike and several volunteers from town, a makeshift shelter had been erected around Storm and Emma's grave. Tarps stretched between poles created a windbreak, and portable heaters powered by a generator provided warmth. Hay was scattered within Storm's reach, along with buckets of fresh water and feed mixed with electrolytes to combat her dehydration. From a distance, it looked like nothing so much as a bizarre archaeological dig, or perhaps a small circus tent erected improbably in the middle of the cemetery. The town council, after some debate, had granted emergency permission for the temporary structure, moved by the Carters' plight and the extraordinary circumstances. As night fell, James and Margaret prepared to leave, assured by Rachel and Mike that they would take turns keeping watch over Storm through the night. "You need rest," Rachel insisted when Margaret protested. "You won't help Emma or Storm by making yourselves ill." Reluctantly, the Carters returned home to their empty farmhouse, where Emma's absence felt even more acute after the emotional intensity of the day. They moved through the evening routine mechanically, neither hungry enough to cook nor tired enough to sleep despite their exhaustion. "Do you think she'll still be there tomorrow?" Margaret asked as they sat at the kitchen table, untouched mugs of tea growing cold before them. James considered the question. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like this. I don't think anyone has. It's like she knows, James. Like she understands death and grief the way we do." Margaret's voice was tinged with wonder despite her sadness. Emma always said Storm was special, that they could communicate in ways other people wouldn't understand. James reached across the table to take his wife's hand. "I know. I didn't really believe it then. I thought it was just a child's imagination." He shook his head. "But after today, I wonder if Emma knew something we didn't," Margaret finished for him. Back at the cemetery, Rachel and Mike settled in for their vigil, taking shelter in the makeshift structure beside Storm. The mare had finally taken small sips of water, but continued to refuse food, her head still resting on Emma's grave. Occasionally, she would let out soft, nickering sounds that seemed to carry the weight of profound emotion. "I've been a vet for 15 years, Rachel said quietly, "and I've never seen behavior like this in an animal. It goes against everything we understand about equine psychology." Mike nodded, his breath forming clouds in the cold air despite the portable heaters. "Emma used to say Storm wasn't just a horse, that she had an old soul." He smiled sadly at the memory. "I thought it was just the way kids talk about pets they love. Now I'm not so sure." As the night deepened around them, they spoke in hushed tones about Emma, her kindness, her unusual connection with animals, the courage she had shown throughout her illness. Their conversation was punctuated by the occasional soft sounds from Storm and the distant hooting of an owl from the woods that bordered the cemetery. "Look," Mike said, suddenly pointing to Storm. "She's taking some of the hay." Indeed, the mare had lifted her head slightly and was nibbling at the hay nearest to her, though her body remained firmly pressed against the grave mound. It was a small sign, but a hopeful one. "That's good," Rachel said, relief evident in her voice. "Maybe by morning she'll be ready to go home." But as dawn broke over Willowbrook Cemetery, Storm remained in the same position, seemingly as unwilling to leave Emma's side as she had been the day before. If anything, she appeared even more settled, having hollowed out a depression in the snow where her body had lain through the night. James and Margaret arrived early, bringing fresh supplies and checking anxiously on the horse's condition. Rachel's examination revealed slight improvement. Storm was no longer severely dehydrated thanks to the water she had consumed overnight, but her refusal to properly eat or move remained concerning. Throughout the day, a steady stream of visitors came to the cemetery. Some were merely curious, drawn by the increasingly widespread story of the grieving horse. But others came with purpose, bringing flowers for Emma's grave and treats for Storm. Children left drawings, and one elderly woman brought a handmade blanket which she ceremoniously draped over Storm's back with tears in her eyes. "Emma helped my grandson at the Therapeutic Riding Center," she explained to Margaret. "He has autism and never connected with anyone until Emma and Storm. I just wanted to do something." As the second day of Storm's vigil drew to a close, no one knew what to expect. The makeshift shelter had been reinforced, additional heaters brought in to combat the dropping temperatures. Storm had eaten a little more hay, but still refused to rise or move away from the grave. "We can't keep this up indefinitely," Rachel warned as she checked Storm's vital signs that evening. "The cold, the lack of proper movement, it's not sustainable." Margaret nodded, her face drawn with worry. "Just one more night, please. If nothing changes by tomorrow." She couldn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. They would have to force Storm to leave, regardless of the mayor's obvious determination to stay by Emma's side. As darkness fell once more and the cemetery emptied of visitors, James and Margaret prepared to return home, leaving Mike and a volunteer from the local stables to watch over Storm for the night. No one noticed the subtle change in the atmosphere around Emma's grave. A barely perceptible shimmer in the air, like heat rising from summer pavement, though the temperature was well below freezing. The night was unusually still. No wind disturbed the branches of the old oak tree that stood sentinel over Emma's grave, and the clouds had cleared to reveal a sky ablaze with stars. Inside the makeshift shelter, Mike dozed fitfully, while Lily, the volunteer from the local stables, kept watch over Storm. The mare had finally settled into what appeared to be sleep, though her body remained pressed against the grave mound, one foreleg extended as if reaching for something, or someone, beyond the veil of earth and snow. Lily, a quiet woman in her 50s who had spent her life around horses, observed Storm with a mixture of professional interest and deep emotion. In all her years working with equines, she had never witnessed behavior like this. Horses were intuitive creatures, sensitive to human emotions and capable of forming profound bonds, but Storm's actions went beyond anything Lily had experienced or heard of. "She loved her," Lily whispered more to herself than to the dozing Mike. "Not just the way animals usually love their people. This is something else." As if in response to her words, Storm's ears twitched, and the mare lifted her head slightly, her eyes reflecting the soft glow from the portable heaters. For a moment, Lily could have sworn those eyes held not just intelligence, but something deeper. A consciousness, an awareness that sent a shiver down her spine despite the warmth of the shelter. Then Storm did something that made Lily's breath catch in her throat. The horse turned her gaze deliberately toward a specific point just beyond Emma's headstone, focusing on what appeared to be empty air with such intensity that Lily found herself looking in the same direction, half expecting to see something there. But there was nothing, just the darkness beyond the shelter, the silent gravestones, and the star-strewn sky above. And yet, Storm continued to stare, her ears pricked forward, her attention completely focused on that empty space. A soft, nickering sound escaped her, different from the mournful whinnies of the previous days. This sound had a different quality to it, almost like a greeting. Lily shook Mike awake, her hand trembling slightly. "Look," she whispered urgently. "Something's happening." Mike blinked sleep from his eyes, following Lily's pointing finger to where Storm now stood, having risen to her feet for the first time in nearly 2 days. The mare took a tentative step forward, then another, moving away from the grave toward whatever invisible presence had captured her attention. "Should we stop her?" Mike asked, uncertain. Lily shook her head. "No, let's see what she does." Together they watched as Storm walked to the edge of the shelter, her movements becoming more fluid and energetic with each step, as if the debilitating exhaustion of the past days had suddenly lifted. At the boundary of the tarp, she stopped, extending her neck to nuzzle at the empty air. "She sees something we don't," Lily said softly. "Or someone." The implication hung in the air between them, too extraordinary to voice directly, yet impossible to ignore. Storm was behaving exactly as she had when greeting Emma, the same eager posture, the same gentle headbutting against thin air. Mike fumbled for his phone. "I should call the Carters." "Wait." Lily placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let's give her a moment." Storm had begun to walk again, circling the shelter with increasing vigor, her hooves leaving clear tracks in the fresh snow. She moved with purpose, as if following an invisible guide, occasionally stopping to nicker softly or press her muzzle against nothing they could see. After completing a full circuit of the shelter, Storm returned to Emma's grave. But instead of resuming her position of mourning, she stood tall beside the mound, her ears forward, her posture alert and almost expectant. "Now," Lily said quietly. "Call them now." While Mike made the call, Lily approached Storm cautiously, murmuring soothing words. The mare acknowledged her with a flick of an ear, but kept her attention fixed on the grave and the empty space beside it. Lily ran a gentle hand along Storm's flank, noting with amazement that the horse's coat felt warm despite the freezing temperature, and her muscles quivered with energy rather than trembling with exhaustion. "The Carters are on their way," Mike said, returning to Lily's side. "I didn't tell them exactly what's happening, just that there's been a change in Storm's behavior." Lily nodded, her eyes never leaving the mare. "Good. They need to see this for themselves." The wait seemed interminable, though in reality it was less than 20 minutes before headlights cut through the darkness as James's truck pulled up to the cemetery gates. The Carters hurried toward the shelter, their anxious faces illuminated by the soft glow of the heaters as they ducked inside. "What is it? What's happened?" Margaret asked breathlessly, her eyes widening as she saw Storm standing alert beside the grave rather than lying on it. Before either Mike or Lily could respond, Storm turned toward the Carters and let out a soft whinny that sounded almost joyful. Then, with deliberate steps, she walked directly to Margaret, gently butting her head against the woman's shoulder in a gesture so reminiscent of Emma that tears immediately sprang to Margaret's eyes. "She's different," James observed, wonder in his voice as he stroked Storm's neck. "It's like she's herself again." "Something happened about half an hour ago," Lily explained, choosing her words carefully. "Storm started acting as if she could see something, or someone, that we couldn't. She got up and began moving around, following nothing that I could see." The implication hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, and James steadied her with an arm around her shoulders. "You think she saw Emma?" Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily hesitated, aware of how it sounded. "I don't know what she saw. I just know that one minute she was grieving, barely responsive, and the next she was interacting with something that made her happy." "Horses are sensitive to things we can't perceive," Rachel had said during her last visit. The words echoed in Mike's mind as he watched Storm's transformed demeanor. The mare that had been on the verge of dangerous exhaustion just hours before now stood alert and energized, her eyes bright, her movements fluid. "Whatever happened," Mike said gently, "it seems to have brought her peace." Storm moved back to the grave, standing beside it rather than on it, her posture watchful, but no longer despairing. The silver pendant on her halter caught the light from the heaters, gleaming like a star against her dark coat. Margaret approached slowly, placing a trembling hand on Storm's shoulder. "Did you see her, girl?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Did Emma come to say goodbye? Storm turned her head to look directly at Margaret, and in that moment, something passed between woman and horse, an understanding, a shared grief, perhaps even a shared comfort. Storm lowered her head to nuzzle Margaret's hand, then did the same to James when he joined them. "I think," James said softly, "that whatever happened here tonight was meant for all of us." They stayed like that for a long while, the four humans and the horse gathered around Emma's grave in the quiet of the winter night. No one spoke of leaving, of the cold, of the late hour. In that strange, sacred moment, time seemed suspended, and the boundaries between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond felt thin, permeable. Outside the shelter, the stars continued their silent procession across the sky. A light breeze had picked up, causing the tarp to rustle gently. Inside, Storm had begun to eat in earnest for the first time in days, pulling hay from the pile Mike had replenished earlier and chewing with methodical determination. "She's going to be okay," Lily said with quiet confidence. "Whatever she needed to happen has happened." Margaret nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I think you're right." She looked at her husband. "And maybe, just maybe, we will be too." Dawn broke over Willowbrook Cemetery with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, the rising sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground and illuminating the makeshift shelter with golden light. Inside, Storm stood calmly beside Emma's grave, no longer in the posture of grief that had defined her for the past 2 days, but alert and present, occasionally lowering her head to graze on the hay that had been refreshed throughout the night. The Carters had remained until the small hours, unwilling to leave after witnessing Storm's inexplicable transformation. They had finally returned home for a few hours of rest, leaving Mike and Lily to continue their vigil with the promise to return at first light. "She's been like this all night," Lily reported when James and Margaret arrived bundled against the morning cold. Eating, drinking, even dozing on her feet like horses normally do. It's as if... She hesitated, aware of how her next words might sound. It's as if she received the closure she needed. Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on Storm. The mare acknowledged their arrival with a soft whicker, but remained near the grave, not in the desperate posture of mourning, but in the manner of a sentinel, a guardian. "Do you think she's ready to come home?" James asked, hope and uncertainty mingling in his voice. As if in answer, Storm turned from the grave and walked toward them with deliberate steps. She stopped before Margaret, lowering her head to allow the woman to stroke her forehead, then did the same with James. The message was clear. She was ready. The dismantling of the shelter and Storm's journey back to the Carter farm drew a small crowd of onlookers. Word of the mayor's extraordinary vigil had spread far beyond Willowbrook, and news vans from neighboring towns lined the cemetery entrance, reporters eager to capture footage of the grieving horse that had become something of a sensation on local news and social media. "Give them space," Mike urged, helping to create a path through the crowd as James led Storm toward the waiting trailer. The mare moved with quiet dignity, neither rushing nor hesitating, her eyes occasionally scanning the faces around her as if searching for someone specific. Dr. Rachel Wilson was waiting at the farm, having been called by the Carters to check Storm upon her return. Her examination was thorough, her expression transitioning from professional concern to amazement as she noted the horse's condition. "This is remarkable," she said finally, removing her stethoscope and stepping back. "Her vitals are strong, no signs of hypothermia or severe dehydration despite spending 2 days lying in the snow. Even her muscle tone is better than I would expect after such prolonged immobility." She shook her head in wonder. "Medically speaking, she should be in much worse shape." "But she's okay?" Margaret pressed, needing the reassurance. Rachel nodded. "More than okay, considering what she's been through. Keep her warm, make sure she continues to eat and drink, and give her time to readjust." She hesitated, then added, "And maybe be prepared for more unusual behavior." Whatever connection Storm had with Emma clearly hasn't been severed by death. The statement hung in the air, neither confirmed nor denied by the Carters. They had witnessed something beyond ordinary explanation at the cemetery, something that defied rational understanding, but that had brought a measure of peace to both Storm and themselves. As Rachel packed up her equipment, a car pulled into the driveway, an unfamiliar sedan with rental plates. A woman emerged, middle-aged with graying hair pulled into a neat bun, her bearing professional despite the casual attire. She approached with confidence but stopped at a respectful distance from the barn entrance. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I'm Dr. Eleanor Reeves from the University of Vermont's Department of Animal Behavior. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I've been following the reports about your horse, and I was hoping I might have a word." James and Margaret exchanged a glance, wary of yet another intrusion into their grief, but also curious. "This isn't a good time," James began, but the woman raised a placating hand. "I understand completely, and I wouldn't dream of disturbing you under normal circumstances. But what Storm has demonstrated, this apparent grief response, the deliberate journey to Emma's grave, the 2-day vigil, it's unprecedented in documented equine behavior." Her voice softened. "It could be important, not just scientifically, but for how we understand the emotional lives of animals and their bonds with humans." Margaret studied the woman, noting the sincerity in her eyes and the absence of the voyeuristic curiosity that had characterized so many of the onlookers at the cemetery. "What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Reeves?" "Simply to observe Storm, to document her behavior, and perhaps to conduct some non-invasive tests to better understand her cognitive and emotional processes, all at your convenience, of course, and with your full involvement." She smiled gently. "In return, I can offer insights that might help you understand what Storm is experiencing and how best to support her through it." Before either Carter could respond, a sound from inside the barn drew their attention. Storm had moved to the entrance and now stood watching them, her intelligent eyes seeming to assess the newcomer. After a moment, she stepped forward, approaching Dr. Reeves with the same deliberate gait she had displayed at the cemetery. The animal behaviorist remained perfectly still, allowing the horse to make the first move. Storm stopped just short of the woman, her nostrils flaring as she took in her scent, her eyes never leaving the stranger's face. Then, with a gentleness that belied her size, she extended her neck and lightly pressed her muzzle against Dr. Reeves's shoulder. "Well," the scientist said softly, clearly moved by the gesture. "Hello to you too." Margaret felt a tightness in her chest ease slightly at the interaction. She doesn't usually warm up to strangers so quickly. Emma was the only one who could get her to trust people. Dr. Reeves nodded, carefully raising a hand to stroke Storm's neck. "The bond between your daughter and Storm must have been extraordinary. The behavior Storm has displayed suggests not just attachment, but a level of emotional processing we rarely recognize in non-human animals." She turned to face the Carters fully. "I believe there's more to Storm's story than grief alone. There's something here that deserves to be understood, not exploited or sensationalized, but genuinely understood." James and Margaret considered her words, each wrestling with their own feelings about sharing Storm and, by extension, their connection to Emma with an outsider. The mare herself had returned to the barn, apparently satisfied with her assessment of Dr. Reeves. "We need time," James said finally. "This has all happened so fast and we're still trying to make sense of it ourselves." "Of course," Dr. Reeves replied, reaching into her pocket for a business card. "Take all the time you need. I'll be staying in town for a few days. If you decide you're open to talking further, I'm at your disposal." As the scientist drove away, Margaret turned to her husband. "What do you think?" James gazed toward the barn where Storm had disappeared into the shadows. I think there's more to what happened at the cemetery than we understand. And maybe... He hesitated, finding the words difficult. Maybe understanding it better would be a way of honoring Emma. She always believed Storm was special. Margaret nodded, slipping her hand into his. Together, they walked toward the barn, toward the horse that had become their last living connection to their daughter. Inside, Storm greeted them with a soft, nickering sound, her eyes holding a depth and awareness that, in the wake of recent events, neither Carter could dismiss as mere animal instinct. Something had changed at the cemetery, something profound and inexplicable. Whatever it was, they sensed it was only the beginning. The days following Storm's return from the cemetery settled into a rhythm that, while tinged with grief, carried a strange undercurrent of expectancy. The Carters found themselves watching Storm closely, looking for signs of the extraordinary awareness she had displayed at Emma's grave. The mare seemed largely returned to her normal self, eating well, responding to basic commands, even accepting brief rides from Mike to ensure her muscles didn't atrophy after her ordeal. Yet there were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when Storm would suddenly alert, her ears pricking forward, her gaze fixing on empty air with the same intensity she had shown that night at the cemetery. "She's doing it again," Margaret would whisper to James whenever they witnessed these episodes. Neither spoke aloud the question that hung between them. Was Storm seeing Emma? A week after the cemetery vigil, they contacted Dr. Reeves. The animal behaviorist had remained in Willowbrook as promised, taking a room at the local inn and spending her days interviewing townspeople who had witnessed Storm's behavior at the grave. She arrived at the Carter farm within an hour of their call, her face alight with barely contained scientific curiosity, tempered by genuine compassion. "Thank you for allowing me this opportunity," she said as James led her to the paddock where Storm was enjoying the weak winter sunshine. "I want to assure you again that my interest is in understanding, not exploitation." Margaret nodded, watching as Storm noticed their approach and trotted over to the fence. "We've been talking about it, and we think Emma would have wanted us to explore this. She was always saying that people underestimated animals, especially horses, that they feel and understand more than we give them credit for." Dr. Reeves smiled, reaching out a hand as Storm stretched her neck over the fence. "Your daughter sounds like she was very insightful." She stroked the mare's forehead gently. "And I think she was right. The science of animal cognition and emotion has advanced significantly in recent years, but we're still only scratching the surface of understanding." Over the next few days, Dr. Reeves became a fixture at the farm. She set up unobtrusive cameras in Storm's paddock and stable to record the mare's behavior, conducted simple cognitive tests that resembled games more than experiments, and spent hours simply observing the horse's interactions with her environment and the people around her. The Carters found her presence surprisingly comforting, her scientific approach providing a framework for understanding their experiences that didn't dismiss or sensationalize them. On the third day of her observations, Dr. Reeves witnessed one of Storm's alert episodes firsthand. The mare had been grazing peacefully in the paddock when she suddenly raised her head, her entire body tensing. Her ears swiveled forward, and her gaze fixed on a point near the old oak tree that stood at the paddock's edge. For nearly 2 minutes, Storm remained completely still, focused on something invisible to human eyes, before letting out a soft whicker and returning to her grazing as if nothing had happened. "Fascinating," Dr. Reeves murmured, reviewing the footage later with the Carters in their kitchen. "There was no external stimulus that I could detect, no unusual sound, no movement, nothing that would typically trigger that kind of alert response in a horse. It's been happening regularly since she came back from the cemetery," James confirmed. always with the same intensity, always focused on empty space. Dr. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. I've documented similar behavior in other animals, particularly those who have lost a close companion. Dogs will sometimes search for their deceased owners. Cats may wait by doors or windows, but this level of focused attention on specific points in space is unusual. She hesitated, then added, "There's a growing body of research suggesting that some animals may perceive things beyond normal human sensory range. Electromagnetic fields, subtle changes in air pressure, perhaps even other phenomena." The pause before other phenomena was slight but noticeable. The Carters exchanged a glance, understanding what the scientist was carefully not saying directly. "You mean ghosts," Margaret said quietly. "You're suggesting Storm might be seeing Emma's spirit." Dr. Reeves smiled gently. "As a scientist, I have to be cautious about making such claims. But I will say this. There are documented cases across cultures and throughout history of animals appearing to respond to presences that humans cannot perceive. Whether these are actual spirits, residual energy patterns, or something else entirely is beyond my ability to determine." She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "What I can tell you with certainty is that Storm's behavior indicates she is perceiving something real to her, something significant, and something that appears to be bringing her comfort rather than distress." The conversation might have continued, but a sudden commotion from outside interrupted them. The sound of Storm's urgent whinnying pulled them all to their feet and out onto the porch. In the paddock, the mare was pacing along the fence line, tossing her head and occasionally rearing slightly, behavior she hadn't displayed since her traumatized early days at the farm. "Something's wrong," James said, already moving toward the gate. Margaret and Dr. Reeves followed close behind. As they approached, Storm's agitation only increased. She galloped back and forth along the fence, her eyes wild, foam beginning to fleck her mouth. When James entered the paddock, she rushed to him, nudging him hard enough that he nearly lost his balance, then immediately turning to run toward the gate that led to the driveway. "She wants out," Dr. Reeves observed. "This isn't random distress. She's trying to communicate something specific." James hesitated, looking to Margaret. "Should we let her out? She might bolt again." Before Margaret could answer, Storm let out a whinny so loud and piercing that it echoed across the property, a sound of pure distress that made the decision for them. "Open it," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever's happening, she needs to respond to it." James unlatched the gate and Storm burst through it, but instead of racing down the driveway as they had feared, she stopped at James's truck, pawing at the ground beside it and looking back at the humans with clear expectation. "I think," Dr. Reeves said slowly, "she wants you to follow her somewhere." The parallel to Storm's cemetery journey was impossible to miss. With a mixture of dread and curiosity, James retrieved his keys from the house. They piled into the truck, James and Margaret in front, Dr. Reeves in the back, and began to follow Storm, who had already started trotting down the driveway toward the main road. Unlike her slow, exhausted journey to Emma's grave, Storm moved with purpose and energy, occasionally looking back to ensure the truck was still following. She led them not toward the cemetery, but in the opposite direction, toward the network of trails that wound through the woods where Emma and Storm had spent countless hours riding together. "The old covered bridge," Margaret said suddenly as Storm turned onto a familiar path. "She's heading for Wicker's Creek." James nodded, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. The covered bridge at Wicker's Creek had been one of Emma's favorite spots, a 19th century structure spanning a narrow but swift-moving stream. In summer, she and her friends would swim in the swimming hole just upstream from the bridge. In winter, they would slide on the frozen creek or build snow forts in the shelter of the bridge's wooden walls. They followed Storm as far as the small parking area at the trailhead, then had to continue on foot as the path narrowed too much for vehicles. The mare slowed her pace but continued to look back frequently, clearly determined that they should follow. "This is remarkable," Dr. Reeves murmured, recording the journey on her phone. "She has a clear destination in mind." The winter woods were silent around them, the only sounds their footsteps crunching in the snow and Storm's occasional soft nickering as if encouraging them to keep up. The covered bridge came into view through the bare trees, its weathered red sides contrasting with the white landscape, the creek beneath it partially frozen, but still flowing in the center. Storm stopped at the entrance to the covered bridge, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The mare pawed at the snow-covered ground impatiently, her eyes fixed on the shadowy interior of the old wooden structure. James, Margaret, and Dr. Reeves caught up moments later, their curiosity mingled with apprehension as they tried to understand what had brought Storm to this specific location with such urgency. "This was Emma's special place," Margaret explained quietly to Dr. Reeves. "She would come here year-round, said it was where she could think most clearly." Dr. Reeves nodded, her scientific mind racing to catalog the possibilities. Animals often associate locations with specific people. The scent memory might be particularly strong here, but even as she offered this rational explanation, Storm's behavior suggested something more complex at work. The mare took several steps into the bridge, then stopped and turned back toward them, nickering softly as if encouraging them to follow. When they hesitated, she repeated the sound, more insistent this time. "She wants us to come inside," James said, stating what was obvious to all of them. They followed Storm into the dimness of the covered bridge, their footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. Shafts of winter sunlight penetrated through the gaps in the aging wood, creating patterns of light and shadow across the floor. Storm led them to the center of the bridge, where she stopped beside a particular section of the inner wall. Margaret gasped softly. "James, look." Carved into the wood, partially obscured by years of graffiti from local teenagers, were the initials EC, surrounded by a rough heart shape. Below it, in Emma's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "Emma and Storm, friends forever, summer 2021. "She carved this the summer after she got Storm," Margaret whispered, her fingers tracing the letters. "I remember her telling me about it, but I'd never actually seen it." Storm nudged the carving with her muzzle, then stepped back, watching them with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any animal should possess. The mare's attention shifted suddenly, her ears pricking forward as she turned to face the opposite end of the bridge. She whickered softly, the same greeting sound they had heard her make at the cemetery. The humans saw nothing, but the hair on the backs of their necks rose as a cold breeze seemed to sweep through the enclosed space despite the still day outside. Storm's posture had changed subtly, alert but relaxed, her head lowered slightly as if in deference to someone approaching. Dr. Reeves, despite her scientific training, found herself stepping back instinctively. "This is remarkable," she murmured, her voice barely audible as she continued to record on her phone. For several long moments, Storm remained focused on the empty air at the end of the bridge. Then, to the astonishment of the watching humans, she began to paw at the wooden floor near the wall, her movements deliberate and precise. "What is she doing?" Margaret wondered aloud, moving closer. Storm continued to paw at the same spot until James knelt beside her, examining the area. "There's something here," he said, running his hand over the weathered wood. "A loose board." With careful movements, he pried up the plank that Storm had identified. The space beneath was shallow, just enough room for a small object to be concealed. James reached in and pulled out a metal box, tarnished with age and damp but still intact. It was the kind of decorative tin that might once have held cookies or holiday treats, its lid embossed with faded snowflakes. "I've never seen this before," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion as James handed her the box. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded tissue paper, was a collection of items that brought immediate tears to her eyes. A friendship bracelet made of colorful threads, a small spiral notebook with a worn cover, a handful of polished stones, a folded piece of paper, and a photograph of Emma sitting on Storm, both looking directly at the camera with what could only be described as identical expressions of joy. "Her treasure box," Margaret whispered, lifting out the photograph. "She must have hidden it here." The folded paper turned out to be a letter, written in Emma's neat handwriting on pale blue stationery. Margaret unfolded it carefully, the paper crinkling beneath her fingers. "To whoever finds this," she read aloud, her voice catching, "if you're reading this, it means you've discovered my secret place. This bridge is where I come when I need to think, when I need to be alone, or when I have important secrets to share with Storm." Margaret paused, gathering herself before continuing. "Storm understands me better than anyone in the world. Mom and Dad think it's just a girl and her horse, but it's more than that. When I look into Storm's eyes, I see someone looking back. Not just an animal, but a soul that knows mine." James placed a steadying hand on Margaret's shoulder as she read on. "Sometimes I think Storm was sent to me for a reason. Before she came, I was so lonely. The other kids at school thought I was weird because I preferred animals to people, but Storm never judges me. She listens with her whole being. When I'm with her, I feel like anything is possible." Margaret's voice faltered as she reached the final paragraph. James gently took the letter from her hands and continued reading. "I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's like a time capsule, or maybe I just want there to be a record somewhere of what Storm means to me. But I believe with all my heart that the bond between us is special, that it's the kind of bond that even death couldn't break. So if anything ever happens to me, please take care of Storm. And if you're reading this and you're not my parents, please make sure they know that I was happy, truly happy, because of this amazing horse who became my best friend. Love always, Emma." A profound silence fell over the bridge as James finished reading. The only sound was the soft rushing of the partially frozen creek below and Storm's gentle breathing. The mare had stopped pawing at the floor and now stood quietly beside them, her eyes moving between the humans and the box of treasures as if she understood exactly what they had found. Dr. Reeves had lowered her phone, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten in the face of such raw emotion. "She led you here deliberately," she said softly, "to these memories, to this message." Margaret carefully returned the items to the box, her tears falling freely now. But how did she know? How could she possibly have known this was here? No one had an answer, but Storm moved closer, gently pressing her muzzle against Margaret's arm in a gesture of comfort. The silver pendant that Emma had loved still hung from the mare's halter, catching the dim light that filtered through the bridge's wooden slats. "I think," James said slowly, his own eyes wet with tears, "that Emma was right. Some bonds can't be broken, not even by death." As if in response to his words, Storm lifted her head and let out a soft whicker, looking toward the end of the bridge where, moments before, she had seemed to greet an invisible visitor. The humans followed her gaze, but saw only the winter landscape beyond the bridge's exit, bare trees, snow-covered ground, and the pale winter sky above. Yet somehow, in that moment, the emptiness seemed less empty, the absence less absolute. Something had changed in the atmosphere inside the old covered bridge, a shift too subtle to name but impossible to ignore. The walk back to the trailhead was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. Storm walked calmly beside them, the urgency that had marked her journey to the bridge now replaced by a tranquil demeanor, The metal box containing Emma's treasures was cradled in Margaret's arms, held close to her heart as if it were the most precious thing in the world, which in many ways it was. When they reached the parking area, Dr. Reeves finally spoke, her voice soft but clear in the winter stillness. "I know this might not be the right time, but I feel I should be honest with you about what I've witnessed today." She took a deep breath, fogging the air before her. "In all my years studying animal behavior, I've never seen anything like this. Storm's actions were purposeful, deliberate, and entirely outside the parameters of what we understand about equine cognition." James nodded, his hand resting on Storm's neck. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that the scientific explanation that Storm associated the bridge with Emma and was drawn there by memory or scent doesn't account for her specifically identifying the location of that hidden box." Dr. Reeves gestured toward the tin in Margaret's arms. "There's something else at work here, something I can't explain within the framework of my discipline." "You think Emma is somehow guiding her?" Margaret asked, voicing the question that had been hovering unspoken between them since the cemetery. Dr. Reeves hesitated, clearly weighing her words carefully. "As a scientist, I'm hesitant to make claims about phenomena that can't be measured or tested. But as a human being who has just witnessed what I've witnessed..." She looked at Storm, who was standing quietly beside them, her intelligent eyes moving between the humans as if following their conversation. "Yes, I think it's possible that some essence of Emma is communicating with Storm in ways we can't perceive." The drive back to the farm was filled with a strange mixture of emotions, grief and wonder, loss and connection, the pain of absence, and the comfort of presence. Storm trotted alongside the truck all the way home, occasionally breaking into a canter as if enjoying the freedom of movement after days of standing vigil at the grave. "She's different now," Margaret observed, watching the mare through the passenger window. "More like her old self, but also, I don't know, more peaceful somehow." James nodded, understanding exactly what his wife meant. The frantic energy that had characterized Storm's behavior at the cemetery had been replaced by something calmer but no less profound, a quiet certainty, a sense of purpose. Back at the farm, Dr. Reeves helped them settle Storm in the barn for the evening. The mare accepted an extra apple from Margaret's hand, then nudged the pocket where Emma's letter now rested as if acknowledging its importance. "I'd like to stay a few more days if that's all right with you," Dr. Reeves said as they walked back to the house. "There's more I'd like to observe, more data I'd like to collect, with your permission, of course." The Carters exchanged a glance, a silent communication born of years together. "We'd like that," James said finally. "Whatever's happening here, it feels important. Not just for us, but maybe for others who've lost someone." That evening, after Dr. Reeves had returned to her room at the inn, James and Margaret sat at their kitchen table, Emma's treasure box open before them. They had gone through each item carefully, every object a window into their daughter's heart. The friendship bracelet she had made at summer camp, the notebook filled with her thoughts about Storm and their rides together, the smooth stones collected from the creek bed beneath the bridge. "I never knew she felt this way," Margaret said softly, running her fingers over Emma's handwriting in the notebook. "About Storm being more than just a horse, I mean. I thought it was a child's natural attachment to a pet." James nodded, his eyes on the photograph of Emma and Storm. She saw something in Storm from the beginning, something the rest of us missed. He looked up at his wife, his face etched with the complex emotions of the day. "Do you think, is it possible that what's happening now is real? That Emma is somehow still here, communicating through Storm?" Margaret considered the question carefully. She had been raised in a practical household, taught to believe in what could be seen and proven. But the events of the past week had challenged those beliefs, forcing her to confront possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary understanding. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I do know that whatever is happening has brought Storm back to us when we thought we might lose her too. And it's given us this." She gestured to the box and its contents. "These pieces of Emma we didn't know existed." James reached across the table to take her hand. "Maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to understand everything to accept the comfort it brings." As they prepared for bed that night, a soft nickering from outside drew them to the window. Storm stood in the paddock, illuminated by moonlight, her head raised as if listening to something only she could hear. They watched as she moved in a small circle, then stopped, her attention fixed on a point near the old oak tree, the same spot that had drawn her attention repeatedly since her return from the cemetery. "Emma's favorite climbing tree," James whispered, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "She used to sit in that lowest branch for hours, reading or just watching the clouds." They stood together at the window, watching as Storm continued her mysterious communion with the invisible. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that eased rather than increased the ache of Emma's absence. It was as if, through Storm, they were being given a glimpse of a truth beyond their understanding, a suggestion that perhaps the boundaries between life and death, between presence and absence, were not as absolute as they had believed. The following days brought a new rhythm to the Carter farm. Dr. Reeves continued her observations, setting up additional cameras and conducting more sophisticated tests of Storm's behavior. The mayor cooperated with these investigations with a patience that seemed almost deliberate, as if she understood their importance. Word of Storm's extraordinary behavior had spread, drawing attention from beyond Willowbrook. Reporters called daily, seeking interviews or permission to film the miracle horse who had mourned at her owner's grave. A television crew from a national network arrived unannounced one morning, only to be firmly but politely turned away by James. "This isn't a circus," he told them. "This is our life, our grief, and our healing. We won't have it turned into a spectacle." Dr. Reeves proved invaluable in helping them manage the unwanted attention, her scientific credentials lending credibility to their requests for privacy. She became not just an observer but an ally, her initial professional interest evolving into genuine care for both the Carters and Storm. "What I'm documenting here goes beyond the scope of my original research," she admitted to them one evening over dinner. "I came looking for data on grief responses in equines, but what I've found—" She shook her head, struggling for words. "Let's just say it's challenging a lot of my assumptions about the barriers between species, and perhaps even between different states of existence." Outside, as darkness fell over the farm, Storm continued her enigmatic communion with the unseen, moving with a grace and purpose that spoke of something far more profound than simple animal behavior. Whatever was happening between the mare and the spirit of the girl who had loved her, it was transforming grief into something else, something that, while still laced with sadness, also contained an undeniable element of hope. Spring came to Willowbrook in gentle increments, the gradual warming of the air, the first tentative green shoots pushing through the soil, the return of birdsong to dawn choruses. At the Carter farm, the changing season brought its own transformations. The raw wound of Emma's absence had not healed. It never would completely. But it had begun to change shape, to become something the family could carry without being crushed beneath its weight. Storm, too, had changed. The episodes where she appeared to communicate with an invisible presence continued, but they had become integrated into the rhythm of farm life. The Carters no longer rushed to the window every time Storm focused on empty air. Instead, they acknowledged these moments with quiet recognition, sometimes even with small smiles. What had once seemed uncanny now felt like a gift, a window, however limited, into a reality they couldn't fully perceive but could nonetheless accept. Dr. Reeves had extended her stay in Willowbrook from days to weeks, her initial research project evolving into something far more comprehensive. The Carters had come to see her not just as a scientist, but as a friend, someone who had walked with them through the strangest and most profound experience of their lives without judgment or skepticism. On a mild April morning, exactly 4 months after Emma's death, Dr. Reeves sat with the Carters at their kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks, photographs, and printouts of data collected during her time at the farm. "I've been invited to present my findings at a conference on animal cognition in Boston next month," she explained, organizing her materials into neat stacks. "With your permission, of course, your privacy would be maintained. No names, no identifiable details." "What exactly would you present?" James asked, curious rather than concerned. "I mean, how do you explain all of this in scientific terms?" Dr. Reeves smiled, acknowledging the challenge inherent in his question. "That's what I've been struggling with. The data is clear. Storm has exhibited behaviors that cannot be explained by our current understanding of equine psychology. Her grief response at the cemetery, her deliberate journey to Emma's hidden treasure, her consistent attention to specific points in space where no detectable stimuli exist, these are all documented facts." She gestured to a graph showing patterns in Storm's behavior. "What's particularly fascinating is the consistency. The locations where Storm appears to perceive a presence aren't random. They're specific, repeated, and often connected to places that were significant to Emma. The oak tree in the paddock, the covered bridge, certain spots in the barn." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "Emma's favorite places." "Exactly." Dr. Reeves leaned forward, her scientific reserve giving way to genuine wonder. "I've consulted with colleagues in various fields, animal behavior, comparative psychology, even neuroscience, and none can offer a conventional explanation that accounts for all the observed phenomena." She hesitated before adding, "I've also spoken with researchers who study what might be called paranormal phenomena." James raised an eyebrow. "I never thought I'd hear a scientist use that word." "Neither did I," Dr. Reeves admitted with a small laugh. "But science is, at its core, about observation and evidence. When the evidence challenges our existing frameworks, it's our frameworks that must adapt, not the evidence that must be dismissed." She gathered her papers together, her expression growing more serious. "What I've witnessed here has changed me, both professionally and personally. I came looking for data on animal grief. I'm leaving with questions about the nature of consciousness, the connections between living beings, and the possibilities that might exist beyond what we can directly perceive." Outside, Storm had emerged from the barn into the spring sunshine, her coat gleaming with health, the silver pendant still hanging from her halter. As if sensing she was being discussed, the mare turned toward the kitchen window, her intelligent eyes seeming to meet those of the humans watching her from inside. "Whatever your scientific colleagues might think," Margaret said softly, "we know what's real. Storm has given us a way to still feel connected to Emma. That's not a delusion or a coincidence. It's a gift." Dr. Reeves nodded, understanding. Science might require rigorous evidence and peer review, but the Carters had experienced something that transcended those parameters. Their truth was valid, whether or not it could be quantified in a laboratory. Later that afternoon, the three of them stood in the cemetery beside Emma's grave. The mound of fresh earth had settled over the winter months, and spring grass had begun to reclaim the disturbed soil. Margaret had planted crocuses that now bloomed in purple and yellow clusters around the simple headstone. Storm stood quietly beside them, neither distressed nor agitated as she had been during her vigil, but calm and present. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Dr. Reeves said as they gazed at the grave. My research here is complete, at least for now. But with your permission, I'd like to return periodically to continue documenting Storm's behavior as time passes. You're always welcome, James assured her. You've become part of this story now. As they spoke, Storm suddenly raised her head, her ears pricking forward. The familiar alertness came over her, but this time it was accompanied by something new. A soft nickering sound followed by what could only be described as a nodding motion, as if she were greeting someone approaching. The humans fell silent, watching as Storm performed this mysterious communion. A gentle breeze stirred the newly budded trees around the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of spring and renewal. For a moment, brief but undeniable, each of them felt a presence, a whisper of something just beyond ordinary perception. Not a ghost in the traditional sense, but an essence, a lingering consciousness that defied the finality of death. "Emma," Margaret whispered, tears filling her eyes not just with sorrow, but with a strange, peaceful recognition. The feeling passed as quickly as it had come, leaving them standing in the ordinary world once more. But Storm's behavior had changed subtly. She moved closer to the Carters, nudging them gently with her muzzle as if offering comfort, her eyes holding a depth of understanding that seemed to transcend her nature. "I think," Dr. Reeves said softly, "that whatever connection exists between Storm and Emma, it's evolving, not fading, but transforming into something sustainable." James nodded, his hand resting on Storm's neck. Emma's letter said their bond was the kind that even death couldn't break. I think she understood something we're only now beginning to grasp. As they walked back toward the cemetery gates, Storm between them, they didn't speak of what they had felt or try to analyze its meaning. Some experiences defied explanation. Some truths existed beyond the realm of words. What mattered was the comfort it brought, the sense that love, in all its forms, continued in ways they might never fully understand, but could nonetheless embrace. That evening, as dusk settled over the farm, Storm stood beneath the old oak tree in the paddock, the last rays of sunlight turning her chestnut coat to burnished gold. From the porch, the Carters and Dr. Reeves watched as the mare lifted her head, her silhouette noble against the darkening sky. A single star had appeared, bright and unwavering in the twilight. Storm whickered softly, a sound of greeting rather than grief, of connection rather than loss. And in that moment it was possible to believe that somewhere, somehow, Emma heard and answered, that the bond between a girl and her horse continued, unbroken and eternal, transcending the boundary between worlds in ways that science might never explain, but the heart could still recognize. The mystery remained, as all true mysteries do, but within it had bloomed something unexpected and precious. Not an answer, but a possibility. Not a conclusion, but a continuation. And in that possibility, in that continuation, the Carters had found a way to move forward, carrying their grief not as a burden, but as a testament to a love that had transformed them all.